The final LEQ of our current unit asks if America faces the same problems today as ancient Rome did 1500 years ago. People love to make comparisons between the United States and Rome. Both are civilizations that were considered at the peak of power across the world. We even build our major government buildings like the Romans did to try and echo back to their dignity and strength. Some people take that same comparison and say that the struggles which the Romans face are similar to struggles that America is facing, and that perhaps we are in decline like the Romans eventually collapsed. It's hard to know if they're correct or not, but these are the types of questions historians should be able to give us some wisdom and insight about. When we study the patterns of the past, we should be able to apply them to the problems of the present and hopefully help to solve those issues. And so it's a good question to ask. Make sure that you have LEQ5 written down. This is here at the bottom of the screen. Plug that onto your green paper, and then record handouts 10 and 11 as well. Pause the video, take a moment to do that. Think a little bit about this vocabulary, similar to the terms we've been reviewing the last few days. These match up pretty closely with handout number 9. Hopefully, you're recognizing that this first definition is culture, right? Those are our shared attitudes and values, as we introduced all the way back at the beginning of this unit. Politics is the study of power. That's how I often remember it. P-O, power, politics. It's very closely linked to government and leadership. The military focuses on conflict between different groups and how countries and others prepare for that conflict through the development of weapons and armies. And economics looks at issues of money and wealth, how material and goods and services are made and spent and produced and shared and everything else. Next, consider these vocabulary terms. Pause the video a moment as you think about what terms would match up. Here are the answers that we would have shared in class. These are different terms that you would have encountered through some of our recent texts and that we're going to continue to review in upcoming lessons. So let's ask you that initial question. Do you agree with the following statement? America is not perfect, but it's superior to others, meaning it's better. Do you think that's true or not? When we look at some recent articles that explore that same question, in 2002, only 49%, in 2017, only 49% agreed. A little bit under half thought that our nation was superior to others. You can see all the way back in 2002, that number was 63%. So it's really surprising that this number is going down, and especially that it's going down for younger people. It shows that many people are starting to lose a little bit of confidence in our country. We're going to think some about if that's fair or not. The first thing we're going to do is explore an article from a popular magazine, right? This is meant for an ordinary audience. In the process, you're going to use a note-taking system to record some notes and think about it. It's called the Cornell note-taking system, and I really like it. It's simple. It's a 3-step process that you can do on any piece of paper. And it's named after Cornell University, a pretty high-end college that lots of great students go to. Yet a few decades ago, they realized that their test scores were struggling. And when they looked more closely at the problem, what they noticed is that a lot of their students didn't know how to take notes. They were smart kids who had kind of just coasted by in high school, never learned specific strategies, and then were struggling when they got to some difficult, longer texts. And so they came up with this really simple system that was meant to make students think more deeply about what they're reading and take notes in a way that would help them later on. The first step is to read the article, much as we typically do. You think a little bit about the source, you preview the title to consider the main idea, you glance briefly at how it's organized, and then you read about it thinking of our big question. Pause the video, read handout number 10 if you have it. If you don't, double check your email and it should be linked in there. Continuing with step 1 is recording some basic notes. On your handout, I made it a little more complicated to divide it into the 3 sections. You can see that we start with his introduction, where he talks about big changes happening in the world. This should remind you of the Thomas Friedman piece earlier. Here's one example. Pause the video and see if you can find the other 2. He wrote about global competition and that he feels that we are increasingly unaware of what's happening in the rest of the world. Let's repeat the same process for what he calls the background information. And this is where he kind of acknowledges that the United States is still doing really well. So for example, he says that we have these very dynamic or fast-changing tech companies. See if you can find the other 3. He also talks about the military, economy, and just a general sense of innovation, that we're always trying to do better. And so these are strengths in the United States. But in the rest of his article, he goes in to identify some challenges and includes a couple of details that back them up. So for example, he says that crime is a significant problem right now in the US, and that we're facing some of the highest homicide rates around. Pause the video, see if you can go find the others. Here are the rest. You can pause the video for a moment to record those down or fix the answers that you have. Here, though, is the next step of the Cornell system that might be new and is really important. And that's where they provide a space for students to create questions that can be answered either by their notes or by the reading itself. They think this is a really important step because the act of creating those questions makes you think, which means you're more likely to understand and remember. Plus, having those questions means later on you can return to them to review. So here's an example. What's one negative part of life that we are ranked number 1 in? If I wrote that question and then came back to it later, that's going to make me think. If I don't remember it, then I need to look, and that process is going to help me prepare for some type of future test or use of this. Create 2 questions of your own. Record them on that left-hand side. Pause the video now while you work. Their final step is to summarize what it is that has been learned. And so oftentimes they even encourage their students to wait a day, to go back and reread their notes and their questions, and then create their summary at that point, which is causing them to have this more distributed review. What we'd like you to do is to answer this question about America. Do we think it's in decline? So based on your reading, you have some ideas for yes and for no. You can choose from either, but name your position and give 1 or 2 details that back it up. Pause the video now while you write. When we're writing like this, these are the pieces we really want to include in our responses. A clear position, evidence, making sure that evidence is relevant, somehow citing the author, and then perhaps explaining ourselves. So here's a strong example. However, you might notice it's missing 1 or 2 pieces down below. Which one is it missing? Well, it doesn't actually cite the author name or article title, so that's something we could do better. Here's a second. This has our position, gives our reason, some evidence, even though it's not a quote, and then briefly mentions the author's name, which makes a huge difference. The second half of this lesson, where we'll spend more of our time in future days, is going to be reviewing a set of 10 theories. In a lot of ways, this is similar to number 9, where we're looking at some different problems that historians propose as possible reasons for the collapse of Rome. which is why it comes from the idea of theories. Initially, these are going to be a lot of review compared to what we did with LEQ5. Afterwards, we're then going to take them another step, and we're going to consider some modern similarities, and then we're even going to look at some political cartoons to help us make some of those comparisons. With each, you'll get a reading that looks like this one. Take a moment, read what's on screen, and think about the questions that go with it. Notice that the questions are tied to specific parts of the reading where you'll see superscript numbers that are helping to make you think. Make sure that once you're done, you're actually taking the time to think of how you'd answer the questions. Sometimes the answer is right in there, sometimes it's more on your own or a review of things we've learned earlier. Pause the video now to read and think of how you'd answer the questions. You do not need to write anything down anywhere. On the back of each of these sheets will be the answers to help us think through them. In class, we'll do some partner discussions and comparing how we did, but for right now, you can just look at how you did compared to what's on the front screen. After you look through them and answer the questions, you'll decide which of our 4 major categories that these fall into. So the outside invasions, which match some of those descriptions of the Huns and the map we looked at earlier, that's an example of a military problem. And if we were summarizing it, these couple of sentences are how I would capture the big ideas. Your job will be to use the reading to plug in some key words. After that, we'll think about some similarities. And so I'm going to put in this example that you can use. One similarity is that in the modern world, America is often faced with what have been called endless wars. Former President Trump used that term and it became very popular when you're looking at like the civil conflict in Syria or the fight in Palestine and Israel or defending South Korea. These are commitments of our soldiers that have lasted decades or even longer. Let's repeat that same process a little more on your own. Pause the video, read the text, think of how you'd answer the questions. Here's how I would have answered them. Pause the video to look them over. And then finally, we'll record some notes for yourself. Take a moment, record on your paper how would you plug in these next 2 boxes based upon that reading. I would have put this in culture. When we look at morals and values, that's a lot about thinking. These would be the key terms that go with it. Pause the video again. Using that information, what would you say could be a similar American problem? So when we're thinking about our values, remember that the early Americans used to care a lot about public service and community engagement. And some people claim that today, too many people more worry about themselves or their social media or playing games, and they don't give enough to their community and get involved. Maybe you agree, maybe you don't. As we continue into future days, we'll use these examples to explore the same topics in a set of stations.